Association just did a very nice 45-page recommendation. It's being debated with the governor and the Secretary of Education at Tuesday right now. But they add two elements, kind of, I would say, a wraparound, and I think they're going to get called on this, but I like the language and I like the debate, that this is always going to be not simply data, but some sort of panel that does judgment with the data. Some kind of judgment after the fact, as opposed to some sort of machine that you crank, and all of this stuff goes in and out comes sausage. So they're adding this, but the piece I really like is that they're making a section, if you will, much the way higher education has done for years, in terms of tenure and so forth, which is what's the contribution to the entity, to the school, in terms of service. And that somehow is beginning to emerge as at least a possibility of some percentage. Well, if you look at that, I mean, if you just stop calmly and it's not coming at you like a, like a bulldozer, and you say, if I had my choice, and if I were going to practice for 35 years, and I was in a thoughtful, safe place with other good professionals, what would I want in terms of feedback and data? Well, I'd like to know how I'm doing, especially with the other variables isolated and pulled up to the table, if I trusted those mechanisms, or at least I thought they were moving in the right direction, number one. Number two, I would like to choose, a good research-based thing that said this is good teaching. We all agree. Let's learn how to pull it apart, observe it, and so forth, so that we have a common frame for looking at it. Let's value some kind of training, input, certification, and let's add a piece of service. We had nothing 5 years ago in terms of the debate in the country, except some pieces of legislation. I'm exaggerating a little bit. We had some of the data which was all over the place because the standards were all over the place. The thing, as we know, is narrow. So my first little riff here is to simply say, I know that's not pretty, and I know it's in some senses a little bit once over, but at least in some way, each time we're together every 3 or 4 months, there's a new piece that we understand a little bit better because this thing is down the track. And I would argue that there's 3 places to look at the way it's moving. One is, I would certainly encourage you to look at Randy Weingarten's speech in February. Pull it off. It's easy to get a hold of, and we'll put it on our little social network game that we're starting. And I think it's a good idea. And the reason is not because her responsibility, and believe me, they know how to do it at the national level of the Federation. Her responsibility is not to give us specifics, but if you look at her, she is clearly trying to capture the momentum here. She is trying to reframe it, but she is answering the major objectives. Fast and fair are the 2 words she starts into. Because this thing is accused of being years long, correctly so, because we got no data, lo and behold, the appeal process takes forever because we got nothing to work with on both sides. That's a heyday for non-learning. So as this thing moves, she's basically saying that's the union perspective, and we all want to hear it because it changes the frame. So, all right. You basically have her deconstructing, if you will, early on this issue. You can feel it move towards some senses. Look at her language. It's very interesting language. All right? Let me give you just a little bit of a tone because language is everything here, especially from the national pulpit. She has no authority in many ways except to frame this thing. All right, so let's look at it. Our proposal begins. Just listen to it. Let it feel the debate changing. This is the union national voice. Our proposal begins with implementing the development and evaluation system we've been promoting and pressing for. It means having clear standards. Teachers need, now this is the process piece. Right? Teachers need to know the content and performance standards they're expected to meet and the measures being used to assess them. These standards should spell out what teachers should know and be able to do. Exactly the same language that they're using on the core standards for children. What do children need to know and be able to do? Translation, she's deliberately doing it. All right. Based on these standards, evaluation should take into account multiple measures, classroom observation, the process, portfolio review, output, appraisal of lesson plans, process, and all the other tools we use to measure student learning, written work, performances, presentations, projects. So you can feel or expand this thing away from summative data, deliberately, consciously, shrewdly. In the context of multiple measures, student test scores based on, and here's a huge, to cross this bridge nationally 5 years ago was unheard of. All right? In the context of multiple measures, student test scores based on valid and reliable assessments should also be considered. Not by comparing the scores of last year's students with scores of this year's students, but by assessing whether a teacher's students show real growth while in his or her classroom. You and I are doing a history lesson on ourselves right now. I mean, this is the way you would do deconstructing textual language. This thing is moving as we speak. And it's not moving at her level. Her job is to frame it. It's moving here out of political pressures. So now I'm going to step to the RTT, and we will get some observations from the Department of Education. And we are very close, and we work, as you know, with Joe Anderson and so forth. Here's the piece that we are now picking up 18 months later. This is my language, not the Department of Education language. We put in strong language around collaboration from the RTT states. So you had to swear up and down in all the unions in the world, sign, and so forth, that we were doing deep collaboration. Actually, Illinois was the only place in the country that was doing any kind of collaboration for the last 50 years, to be very frank. Right. A little bit in Wisconsin, that shows where we got to on that one. Louise, Minnesota, we were doing some 10 years ago, but it was minimal. Massachusetts, good work, so forth. But everybody signed up, all right? And of course, if you got that money, all right, it was a wonderful day. The next day, you looked at what you had just committed to, and the first thing you committed to is a collaborative process to put together earlier than most of us, this evaluation piece. So Mary and I get a call, all right, from Joe and the Secretary's office in the last 2 or 3 months saying there's nothing happening at the state levels in the 12 RTT states. You can imagine where they are. They spend billions of dollars on this. This thing has to be a collaborative approach, and the states are saying, the chief state school officers are saying, Mary met with them, I'm meeting with the union leadership in 3 weeks, all right? Basically, they're saying, what the hell is this thing called collaboration? We've not been doing it, and we got to do it now at a high trust level to do some of the hardest weight training you can do, the hardest lifts. So my point of that is then step back and say, here was the early salvo around collaboration, the Denver conference. The day after we left the Denver conference and the high-profile collaborative celebration, Walker announced war in Wisconsin. The day after. So if you didn't sleep really well that night, you're not going to sleep at all this year. And so the point is, this thing's all over the map. It's unprepared. And it's unprepared because of heavy lifting that everybody's committed to on this. The last piece, and then for your consideration, is one that I've been batting again, back and forth, and here it is. And I have to do it because Louise says I have to draw a triangle.
We thought we had an imposter.
Well, this is my feminine side. Now it's my male side. All right. There. I feel better. I feel better already. Here's the challenge for you to be thinking about on this one, because it's moving before our eyes, and there is no policy direction here, but I would argue to you, pay attention. And this is this one. School happens here in classroom. This is where we educate children. This is the work. We are built in strange fashion, all right, at this thing called a district, or a LEA. We are built there because we were, in some senses, we don't trust government, number one, but number two, we were settled at this level. That is to say, we were settled in small local communities, and maybe it was this big when it started, but then it gets a few more, and so forth and so on. So there is a thing called an LEA, a Local Education Association. There's not only a few of those, in Illinois there are 900 of those. 900 of those. Let me say it again. And each one of these, because the union had to organize where you would basically negotiate things, all right, they basically build their lean-to here. And the Federation, they're both different here, so let's pay attention. The Federation was the first out of the box, and they basically organized the large urban systems. They followed what? Number 2. All right, Chicago number 1, right? Then follow their numbers, and you'll find out who is historically for a while. But basically, they were organized at this level. The EA, when it follows, as you know, comes out of in some senses, the administrative group, and then comes back towards teachers and so forth. It actually builds a very strong state organization. The Federation doesn't need it, in quotes, because they are in big, big cities. This thing still, in some senses, separates them very a good deal, because the EA is very strong and driven from here with a whole lot of staff and so forth. The Federation is here, in terms of its political mechanisms, the way it thinks, the way it acts, and so forth. It gives, because of some history and so forth, it gives Randy a bully pulpit that is not hooked here. And so she can, in some senses, say almost anything she wants. And some of her predecessors were national leaders who used the New York Times to basically beat, public education in any way. On the contrary, the NEA is locked in a political process made up of state associations. Locked in good and bad sense, very politicized, and in some senses, the president and the officers do not have a carte blanche to say whatever they think and to frame things. They have to be extremely careful and to get permission at this level, to do that. It means that you have very different voices, and that affects us profoundly in some way. So that's the first piece, is that's just the way it is. The second piece, and I'm not going to belabor this because we've been in it before, but this group, this thing called the Federales, basically was not active until No Child Left Behind. Nobody ever heard of them intruding, until 10 or 12 years ago. All of a sudden, they're there, and they're there mandating what the states will do. The first attempts are only fair, but No Child Left Behind is a big deal, and it's a big deal forcing the 50 states to move in terms of standards, we all know, measurements, accountability, classifications of children. Those are huge breakthroughs and ramifications for not movement. All of those chickens are coming home to roost. All of them. This administration basically did not change that linkage. As a matter of fact, Marty has used the federal pulpit to move dollars in here. The RTD was a competitive state to state. Very new in terms of kind of changing the arena and so forth. The reason this is not a kind of a riff here, I want to point out what's happening. What's happening is that we are going to have, within 2 years, 4 standards. It means that we're going to have national standards in 3 or 4 of the major areas: math, science, literacy, and so forth. It means that in some senses, the state that wasn't very active around it anyway, and the 900 boards in Illinois and so forth, are not setting standards. Within a couple of years, this is the standard for the country, and there will be measurements. And none of looks like the accountability language is going to go away. But the piece I want to point out to you is the accountability language in many ways is targeted not where you would have expected it to be targeted. It is targeted not at the LEA level, it is targeted at the school site. It's Peoria High School that is in some senses on warning, given 3 options: close it, surgically remove it, half of it, a fourth of it,